Hello, everyone. I'm Valerie Wade, the director at Crown Point Press in San Francisco. Welcome to Print Month. Today, it is my great pleasure to introduce the fourth panel discussion of the month, Perspectives on Diversity in American Printmaking. The idea for this panel originated back in January from a series of conversations with Karin Breuer, who is the curator in charge of the Achenbach Foundation for Graphic Arts. We were discussing how different opportunities emerged in printmaking for women artists, women publishers, Indigenous artists, and artists of color over the decades, and how printmaking has served this diverse community historically and into current times. We decided to explore this topic further by planning a panel discussion. 4 IFPDA members, 3 from Western states, were invited to share their expertise about artists ranging from Mary Cassatt to Louise Nevelson to Charles Gaines. Originally, the panel was going to take place in the auditorium at the Legion of Honor, but like many of other museum events this year, we were facing a long postponement. Happily, the perfect moment arose to move the panel online when the plans for Print Month were forming. Karin Breuer is the moderator for today's panel discussion, and she will introduce each of the panelists. For those of you who haven't had the opportunity to meet her, let me introduce you. I first met Karin when the Achenbach Foundation acquired the Crown Point Press archive in 1991. And later in 1997, we had the opportunity to work together on Crown Point's 35th anniversary exhibition, which was held at the Legion of Honor. Over the years, I've continued to admire her scholarly approach to projects, her vast knowledge of art history from old masters to contemporary, and her thoughtful understanding of the medium of printmaking. Karin Breuer has been at the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco since 1985, when she joined as an assistant curator. Over the past 35 years, she has curated more than 50 exhibitions at the Legion of Honor and the de Young on subjects as diverse as Richard Diebenkorn's prints, Henry Matisse's artist books, and 20th century landscape drawings. From 1992 to 95, she directed the curatorial effort of the Achenbach Collection Management Project, a massive computer inventory of the collection. In 2002, she was named Curator of Contemporary Graphic Art and Curator of the new de Young Planning. For the de Young project, she served as coordinator of the art installation for the 300,000 square foot museum. In 2007, she was named Achenbach Curator in Charge. Her Fine Arts Museum publication projects include The Expressionist Era in Germany, 1990, 35 Years at Crown Point Press, 1997, Japanesque, The Japanese Print in the Era of Impressionism, 2010, Ed Bruchet in the Great American West, 2016, and most recently, Ed Hardy, Deeper Than Skin, 2019. On behalf of the IFPDA and the IFPDA Foundation, I would like to thank all of our cultural partners, including the Achenbach Foundation for Graphic Arts, for collaborating with us for Print Month, which is held in conjunction with the IFPDA Fine Art Print Fair. Thank you all for joining us. Let's get started. Karin?
Thanks, Valerie, for that very nice introduction. And thank you all for being here this morning and this afternoon if you're here on the East Coast. One of the benefits of this new Zoom webinar format world that we live in is the ability to reach a far wider audience than a location-based panel. On the other hand, grappling with some of the technical aspects has been challenging for many of us. We promise to do our best today, but bear with us. I'll introduce the panelists first, and then we'll begin with short talks from each of them in chronological order. As they speak, please don't hesitate to send your questions to the Q&A host button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to address them at the conclusion of all 4 presentations as time allows. Marc Rosen was long associated with Sotheby's Auction House, first in 1965 in London, and then in New York, where in 1985 he became its director of Impressionist and Modern Drawings, and later expanded that focus to Impressionist and Modern Paintings, Drawings, and Sculpture. In 1995, Marc left Sotheby's to launch a business as an independent art advisor and private dealer, and with his partner, Susan Pinsky, established the firm of Marc Rosen Fine Art Limited. Their New York gallery has featured many exhibitions on the prints and drawings of Renoir, Gauguin, Redon, Picasso, and Mary Cassatt, about whose art he'll speak to us today. In 1971, Dan Lenau established the Annex Galleries in Santa Rosa, California. Since then, the gallery has focused on the secondary market of so-called forgotten printmakers and sought to revive the reputations of several via a series of print exhibitions on subjects such as early California printmaking, WPA printmakers, and Mexican prints by the Taller de Grafica Popular and the artists of Atelier 17. From his informed perspective, Dan will speak with us about women in printmaking from the turn of the century through the 1950s. Diana Gaston is director of the Tamarin Institute, based in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Her exploration and research of tamarin started when she served as curator of prints and photographs at the University of New Mexico Art Museum from 1989 to 1993, where the Tamarin Archive is held. Subsequently, she held positions as curator at the Museum of Photographic Arts in San Diego and associate director of San Francisco Camera Work. Today, she'll focus on the ideas around diversity in the American print Renaissance narrative, as represented by June Wayne and a generation of women printmaker publishers. Our fourth panelist is Rhea Fontaine, who joined Paulson Bott Press in Berkeley in 2002, and with the retirement of Renee Bott in 2016, became partner and gallery director of Paulson Fontaine Press. The press, founded in 1996 by Pam Paulson and Bott, emerged from San Francisco Bay's rich tradition of fine art printmaking. In her role as partner and director, Rhea is one of the first African American women to publish fine art prints by contemporary artists. She is dedicated to contributing to the image archive of artists of the African diaspora at Paulson Fontaine Press, which has published over 150 editions with Black artists. So let's begin today with Marc. Marc, tell us about the remarkable American Cassatt, an American artist who was active in Impressionist circles in the late 19th century.
Well, there we go. Good. Good afternoon, good morning. Mary Cassatt, whose dates are 1844 to 1926, appears to have had a very strong sense of herself and of what she wanted to do at an exceptionally early age. When she was 16, she began the serious study of art at the distinguished Pennsylvania Academy of Arts. This was early days in the women's rights movement, and though it was usual for young ladies to be encouraged to learn about art and music, it was something altogether different to aspire to become a professional artist. She was 22 when she set off for Europe to study the old masters in the way she had always dreamed of, copying the pictures hanging on the walls of the great museums to hone her technique. By the time she was 24, she had a work accepted at the prestigious Paris Salon, an exceptional achievement for any artist, and a female American artist at that. This is just to give you an idea of some of the way her works looked in the early years when she was fresh from studying Baroque to Old Master paintings in various museums in Italy and Spain, and incorporating her observations into her own brushwork and imagery. She was forced to return home in 1870 during the Franco-Prussian War, and her father did not want her to return to Europe, but a commission from the Archbishop of Pittsburgh to paint copies of two works by Correggio enabled her to return. In 1874, she was included for the 5th time in the Salon, where her strong and forthright portrait of a woman prompted the comment from Degas, "There is someone who feels as I do." He was referring, I think, to the directness of her observation of the model and the freshness of her evocation of that person's presence. Coincidentally, this was also the year of the first Salon des Indépendants, the Impressionists. Later that same year, she established her residence in Paris. That's in 1874. The conservative constraints of the Salon, which she had at first welcomed and where she had at first hoped to be accepted as a serious artist among all others. The Salon rejected her submissions in 1877. And she was at that point happy to accept Degas' invitation to show with the Impressionists, with whom her ideals were by that time much more in sync. The next few years began a period of intense exploratory study of imagery and technique. Cassatt and Degas planned a print publication which was to be called Le Jour et la Nuit. They worked on this for side by side in his studio, because Degas had set up a printmaking shop in his apartment. This formed the foundation for their lifelong, close artistic relationship.
Marc, you're forgetting to tell her to do the slides.
A time to change slides. Perhaps significantly, Degas' own creation for this purpose, for his publication Le Jour et la Nuit, was an image of Mary Cassatt at the Louvre. He had actually done another study of her at the Louvre, which was maybe more radical in its composition, but reverted to this one as more suitable for publication. Both artists shared an interest in theater, but whereas Degas, as a man, could portray theatrical events from any point he chose, including backstage and dressing rooms, Cassatt could properly only appear in the boxes. That was the convention of the day, and so that was her point of view. Could we have the next images? Now, it's obvious that that there is a close relationship between these two works. The one on the left had been painted already in about 1878, and Cassatt then returned to that image as a possible source for an idea for the publication Le Jour et la Nuit, which, as the name implies, is a study in light and dark and values that can be explored with particular effect in printmaking. The work on the right is obviously based on the one at the left, but she decided partway along to suppress the second figure and concentrate on a single one. It was an idea that was developing in the mind and that she was working on experimentally for a while. The next slide. Yes, I'm showing the one on the left just because it is a particularly magnificent example of her work as a pastel artist. I remember this one very vividly, having been up front with it at Sotheby's years and years ago. The one image on the right shows her changing emphasis entirely and producing an image for this publication, Le Jour et la Nuit, in which the figure, now alone here, but still with her shadow in the mirror, rather than with a sister or friend next to her. The principal figure is shown alone with a fan and with the line of the fan echoed in the curves of the balcony. She's obviously interested in projecting the scene, and as the title of the publication was intended to show issues of life and dark. So the features of the principal figure, of the only figure, are submerged in light and unreadable in detail. as are the details of the audience members in the background who appear as little points of light above the front of the balcony. Next slide. This is a, let's jump around a bit. The death of her sister, Lydia, interrupted her work. And though she soon returned to painting, she did not seriously take up printmaking again until 1889, when she produced studies in soft ground and aquatint, and most importantly, a series of 12 virtuosic dry points for the Galerie Durand Ruel. This is a particularly effective example of the work she did in dry point. She realized that in printmaking, you could focus attention on what you chose to emphasize, and there was no conventional requirement, or at least it was a secondary matter, to fill out every detail of the plate. She very deliberately worked on the center of her composition, the face of the young woman, and on her immediate context with the tea service on the table, and left the rest to the merest few suggestions and tonal blurring on the plate so that the viewer could imagine the complete picture from what she gave. The death of her sister Lydia had interrupted her work, as I said, and this was kind of taken up again in towards the end of that decade. The time of her doing this work is also the time period when she made her first tentative experiments with adding color to her copper plates before printing. And this prepared her way for the historic achievement in color printmaking that arrived next. In 1890, she viewed the major exhibition of Japanese art that included the intimate series of color woodcut prints of the life of a courtesan by Utamaro, as well as works by other Japanese artists. This exhibition had a powerful impact on the entire art community, but for Cassatt, it opened an exciting way forward. She wrote to her friend and fellow artist Bertha Morisot, urging her to visit this exhibition. You should come and dine here with us, and afterwards we could go to see the Japanese prints at the Beaux-Arts. Seriously, you must not miss that. I dream of it and don't think of anything else but color on copper. Cassatt's vision, next slide. Cassatt's vision led to the creation of her series of 10 color aquatints presenting moments in the daily lives of well-to-do women in modern Paris. So we're going from courtesans in Japan to well-to-do modern women in Paris. The series was presented by her dealer, Paul Durand Ruel, in a solo exhibition he dedicated to her art in April of 1891. Another fairly major achievement for a woman artist in Paris at the time. Even though in Paris, women were more accepted as artists than in the States, which is one of the reasons she settled there, but still having a solo exhibition at Durand Ruel, that was major. And I show this work in particular first of that series because it shows her interest in the compositional innovations in Japanese prints and the line of the neck of the woman, which echoes very much the Japanese interest in that aspect of feminine beauty. And the next slide, please. This is another work from this series in which she really invented or reinvented the art of color printmaking from copper by using 2 or 3 plates with colors discreetly added in one area or another. And she herself painted the color onto the plate before the printing of each impression. So they could each vary from the other. And in these two versions, the blue background impression is a unique proof in that color, which Cassatt kept for herself. It's always sensitive to currents in public, in what the public was ready to accept. She did a published version in a much more subdued palette, which allowed her to do a little further tinkering with the balance of the composition, emphasizing more the foreground figure with a deeper tone and articulated pattern on the seamstress's dress. This also makes the elaborate composition of crossing diagonals more pronounced. There's our view down on the composition, the angle of the at which the floor and the wall meet, and the figural diagonal of the seamstress to the woman being fitted. Next slide. This work is called In the Omnibus. In a preparatory drawing, a male figure is included, harking back to the earliest popular genre of public transport depictions. One thinks of Degas, of Daumier for hurly-burly in the public transport, but Cassatt deleted that figure and left us to focus entirely on her subject, the mother, the nursemaid, and the child. Presented here just simply, almost frontally, and in beautiful, vivid colors. In the next image, we'll look at the woman bathing, La Toilette, the choice of subject, and the daring sweep of line defining the woman's back invoke the subject matter and stylized presentation of Utumaro's series of the life of a courtesan. Because though she was definitely a student of anatomy, that precise transposition to a print image was not her intention here. It was more of an abstraction, an artistic idealization of the shapes. Cassatt had to overcome not only gender issues, which she had achieved by the force of her personality and concentrating on outwardly accepted subject matter for a woman artist, but also the fact that she was an American. At the same time, the critical acclaim that she received in Europe helped to elevate her reputation in America. Galeries Durand Ruel had begun actively promoting her paintings and prints in the States, and her growing reputation in the States led to a commission to paint a mural for the Women's Building at the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago. Next image, yeah. This is a color aquatint she did on one of the elements of that composition, the central portion of that mural. It's called Gathering Fruit. And one thing that interests me in this is the way she plays with representation and realistic representation or not of the scene, because it's almost impossible when you look at it closely to figure out what path is leading where, and is that an opening in the wall, what's going on exactly. And this is all quite deliberate. She pretends to present you with a complete image, but leaves you wondering about all sorts of things compositionally. It's a special way of keeping one's attention to an image. The colors, by the way, in every impression of these things, as I've said before, will vary because she could play with the color of the dress of each of the two figures with extra tints on the fruit, et cetera, which she did. So it's almost a series of unique works whenever you look at an edition. And her editions, by the way, were very small. A big edition for her was 25, and there were one or two 50s for special reasons. But anyway, some of her later explicit reference, some of her later works return to her early studies in Italy with explicit references to artisan Renaissance imagery. Could I have the next slide? This is the last slide, you'll be happy to know. This subject, which is simply titled By the Pond, is clearly based on Italian carved marble, low relief religious sculpture. It would have been in Italy and marble, it would have been a matter of showing the Virgin and Child in the foreground with a pictorially flattened and abstracted landscape background in low relief. Of course, in Cassatt's image, this separation of the front plane and the background in a formal way is still clear. And it's also apparent that the child's contemplative gaze is supposed to make us think of the Virgin and Child, with Christ having a very much different kind of thought than his mother. Now that's, I think, enough to start with and probably enough to end with, but I look forward to questions after. Thank you.
Thanks, Marc. And now we'll turn to Dan Leenow, who will talk about American women artists active in printmaking from the early 1900s to mid-century.
Greetings, everyone, and thank you to Karin, Valerie, and the IFPDA for making this discussion possible. My focus for today's presentation as a secondary market print dealer is on just a few of the early 20th century organizations that exhibited and included women printmakers. Please pardon my raspy voice, the smoke from the fires is still being felt. I will quickly feature prints by 11 women printmakers from these organizations whose works we have continued to try to keep alive by creating a collector base and a consistent market for their works during our last 50 years of existence. There are hundreds more I don't have time to mention. Slide 1. Now I'm not, okay. The 1915 Panama Pacific International Exposition in San Francisco featured over 20,000 works of art from around the world and lasted for 12 months. Its effects lasted for decades. The American printmaking section featured prints by 29 women. 2 of these women were Helen Hyde, shown in this slide, and Bertha Lum, slide 2. Both of whom lived in Japan in the early 20th century and learned the technique of color woodcut there. Bertha Lum developed her unique raised line woodcut, such as this example, in China. Slide 3, please. In Massachusetts, 5 women artists who had learned woodcut together in France settled in Provincetown, and with B.J.O. Nordfeld founded in 1915 the Provincetown Printmakers, who were working with the innovative white line single block color woodcut method. Co-founder Blanche Grambs, from this slide, moved to Provincetown in 1915 and over the years became the face of the Provincetown method. Slide 4. Cora Boone from California learned the technique from Lamell and taught the Provincetown method in California in the 1930s. Slide 4. Slide 5. During the Great Depression, Franklin Delano Roosevelt put artists to work with a national program that hired printmakers and other artists to work creating artwork for the United States government. The WPA and the Federal Art Projects Project included male and female artists of all ethnic, religious, and political backgrounds, and included immigrant artists that had escaped the economic crises in Europe and moved to the US. The prints were done in editions of about 25 impressions and were owned by the government. Slide 6. Oh, excuse me, that was, I'm sorry, Blanche Lazelle, whose slide was just up, was a social realist and social activist, and she was one of 219 artists that were arrested protesting the layoff of over 4,000 artists by the FAP. Now slide 6. Barbara Warren headed the Wisconsin Handicraft projects and hired dozens and dozens of women printmakers to print block prints on fabric, such as this example. Slide 7. Jennie Lewis was a lithographer, and she worked in the San Francisco WPA, where there was basically one lithopress to print with, and she did some marvelous modernist work. Slide 8. Esther Gentle was trained in screen printing, which was developed as an art form in the WPA, formed the Esther Gentle reproductions in New York after the WPA, and she hired many of the women printers from the WPA to reproduce paintings in color serigraphy from the museum collections for the museums to sell in their gift shops. She always worked with the artist's approval. Slide 9. In 1940, escaping the Nazi invasion of Paris, printmaker and founder of the experimental Atelier 17, Stanley William Hayter, moved the studio to New York, where he reopened. The studio was open to all printmakers who were interested in experimental printing, and it was not based on gender, race, national origin, or religion. Abstract printmaker Shirley Witebsky and her husband Krishna Reddy were amongst the earliest printmakers experimenting with the intaglio process of what we now call viscosity printing, where all the colors are printed in one pass. Slide 10. Sue Fuller worked at the Atelier 17 in soft ground etching, where she impressed into the soft ground fabrics and textiles to create a lot of her dynamic imagery. And slide 11. Louise Nevelson used a multitude of intaglio techniques to accomplish her large abstract expressionist images. Historian and author Christina Weil recently published a book titled The Women of Atelier 17, where she discusses the importance and influence of women on 20th century printmaking. This book won the IFPDA Foundation Book Award this year. I've not even scratched the surface of all the other printmakers and organizations who have not been included in the market and in the history books. For many, their work is still around, and even if they aren't, it's never too late to be given inclusion. Please vote. Our futures depend on it. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. And now we'll go to Diana Gaston, who'll address the achievements of June Wayne and a generation of women who revitalized American printmaking in the 1950s and 1960s.
The 60s marked a period of great innovation and growth in American printmaking. A wave of new workshops and skilled printers ignited a new era of potential for the medium, and this emerging movement has been described as a print renaissance. June Wayne anticipated this in her 1959 proposal to the Ford Foundation to fund a workshop in Los Angeles. As she wrote, "A handful of creative people is all that is needed for a renaissance in the art, if that handful comes together at the right time, in the right place." From the outset, June Wayne imagined a program of national reach and Tamarind as a catalyst to restore an environment in which printmaking could thrive. Over a 5-year period, 3 key workshops opened on the East Coast and the West Coast. ULAE, Tamarind Lithography Workshop, and Crown Point Press. These 3 workshops were founded and directed by women, and of the trio, only Kathleen Brown of Crown Point Press was a printer. ULAE had the brilliant master printer Robert Blackburn in the workshop during the early years. Tamarind had master printers Garrow and Tresian, Erwin Hollander, and Ken Tyler in the workshop. These 3 storied workshops continue to operate today, working independently from one another, each with their own philosophy and stable of artists. These workshops set the standard for post-war printmaking in America. The setting of Los Angeles during the 60s had an enormous influence on Tamarind's early years. Tamarind was referred to by one critic as operating from a Hollywood backwater, yet LA had cultural, economic, and technological influence and an atmosphere of possibility that made this experiment work. Today, Tamarind continues very much the same objectives as a unique educational print center with the only printer training program of its kind in the world. We focus in on cultivating the technical and collaborative skills of the printer to achieve the vision of the artist. This exchange is what we think of as collaborative printmaking. Some artists look to the printer for technical guidance and emotional support in trying a new medium. Others work very independently, and truly the connection to the printer is unique with each artist. The idea is to foster an environment where the artist feels completely supported, experimentation is encouraged, and artists can realize their best work. Tamarind developed this philosophy, shared the research, and articulated the role of the collaborating printer. We continue this approach today through our publishing program and educational mission. Tamarind brought a holistic approach to the concept of the professional workshop. The Tamarind Way created standards for print documentation and a model for a self-sustaining workshop. Many of these practices are now implemented in workshops around the world. During the first 2 decades, the Tamarind trained printers shown here established or contributed to major workshops and energized contemporary printmaking. While in many ways the Tamarind printer training program was a great success, Tamarind can't point to much diversity among printers during this phase. While there were many women who participated as artist fellows, women were openly discouraged from participating in the printer training program during the first decade. So for the first decade, Tamarind awarded artist fellowships. Typically, artists came to the LA workshop for 2 to 3 months and worked with a team of printers. Artists were nominated by a national committee. Emphasis was on bringing established artists to the workshop. Diversity of style, geographic location, and reputation were the main criteria in artist selection, with the possibilities of what the medium of lithography could do as the workshop's primary focus. By 1970, Tamarind had trained 50 master printers and had come to the end of its decade-long experiment to revive the art of lithography. With the support of the Ford Foundation, Tamarind relocated to Albuquerque, situated now with the resources and oversight of a major research university in a freestanding building off Route 66. With Clinton Adams as director, Tamarind Lithography Workshop became Tamarind Institute. During this transition, Tamarind expanded into publishing, established a formal archive with the University of New Mexico Art Museum, and brought more diversity to the workshop. The move to New Mexico engaged the workshop with a whole new community of artists from the region, including Native American artists and artists who were teaching at the Institute of American Indian Arts and at the university. Just as its founders envisioned, bringing a diversity of creative approaches to the workshop produced a great range of lithographic work and technical advancement. There was a flourishing of figurative, conceptual, and painterly work that came out of the 70s and 80s at Tamarind. Tamarind has seen a sea change over the past 5 years, with new leadership and a new team in the workshop led by Tamarind master printer Valerie Remling and education director Brandon Gunn. The founding principles of Tamarind continue to guide our mission, and the main focus of our operation are collaboration and publishing with invited artists, a rigorous educational program with global reach, programs to engage the public and cultivate collectors, and providing resources and community for printmakers. We deliberately seek out diverse artists, including artists of different generations and disciplines, women and BIPOC artists, many who are new to printmaking. As you take a spin through our production, you'll see work by Nick Cave, Willie Cole, Robert Pruitt, Margot Humphrey, Shanique Smith, Noel Anderson, Rashad Newsom, and Tween Oji Odutola, among just a few of the Black artists we have published over the decades. In closing, I want to underscore the importance of attracting more diversity to printmaking, starting with young printers, art historians, and curators. Tamarind has trained printers who have established workshops, printers who work as educators, and professional printers who staff workshops around the world. Tamarind is a critical entry point into the larger community, and it is essential that we all work to diversify our pool of printers and versioning print experts. This could be a tipping point for the field in general, and it requires commitment and collaboration if we are to deepen and diversify the print community as a whole.
Thank you, Diana. Next up is Ria Fontaine, who will speak about Paulson Fontaine Press's history of working with Black artists.
Hi, thank you so much. I'd like to just thank the IFPDA, Karin Breuer, and Valerie Wade for having me. Let me share my screen here. So I've been asked to speak a bit about Paulson Fontaine Press's history and our commitment to working with Black artists. So I will start there. Pam Paulson and I are asked about this a lot, especially given the current reckoning with the fact that Black Lives Matter. When looking back at the years of publishing, both before and after I became partner, Pam and I bonded over our shared interest in American history, specifically the history of civil rights in America, and the often ignored histories of the many descendants of slaves. We both saw a serious lack of representation and inclusion in the art world, and this made our interest and dedication to this path even stronger. Thinking more about this, I realized that we both had formative experiences with two very radical painters early in our careers. Pam was a student of Robert Colescott, and I was deeply influenced by a friendship with the painter Manuel Ocampo. Both artists were unapologetically addressing race and power and post-colonial theory in their work, and I think that our exposure to their fearlessness around these conversations had a huge impact on the way we began to see the world and ultimately the way we've decided to run our press. A very interesting part of this is that while we become well known for this focus at the press, just a little over 30% of our roster is Black. I think that this is really telling, and it goes to show how much more room for growth there is in our field. We would really love to see everyone that's running a business in the arts or otherwise look at these percentages, whether it be for artists published or staff hired or vendors utilized. But really, I think even more interesting than a discussion about our dedication to publishing and supporting Black artists are the interests and the ideas of the artists that we published. That said, as I move on with this short presentation, I'd like to focus on the legacy of Los Angeles-based Charles Gaines. Remarkably, we took a circuitous approach to meeting Charles, and years before we learned about his work and his impact, we published editions with two of his former CalArts students, Edgar Arsenault and Gary Simmons, whose work I'll briefly talk about today. We were drawn to each artist's work separately, never knowing, one, that they were each aware of each other, or two, that they had both been so impacted by Gaines' tutelage. The title of this talk, seemingly disparate, describes both this curatorial experience that we had and the way that Gaines' methodical and objective approach to art making and thinking sets the stage for common threads to be discovered. A pivotal figure in the field of conceptual art, Charles employs the use of formulas and systems, most often in the form of the grid, to make drawings, photographs, and video installations that interrogate relationships between the objective and the subjective realms. Gaines is one of the few African-American artists who worked in this genre during the 1970s, creating a conversation with the practices of Sol LeWitt, Mel Bachner, and John Cage. His exploration of abstraction and aesthetics as a means to explore ideas about perception, objectivity, and relationships has influenced a younger generation of artists, including Edgar Arsenault, Marc Bradford, Laura Owens, Rodney McMillian, and Gary Simmons. Recent exhibitions include a survey show titled Charles Gaines Grid Work 1974 to 1989, organized by the Studio Museum in Harlem in 2014 and exhibited at the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles the following year. Charles Gaines is represented by Hauser and Wirth and Gallery Max Hetzler in Berlin, a legendary and beloved teacher at CalArts for the past 30 years. The institution recently honored his impact with the launch of the Charles Gaines Faculty Chair, created by the generosity of philanthropist Eileen Harris Norden. This transformative gift will provide much needed support to Black and underrepresented faculty in the School of Art. For our first project together with Charles, we continued his Numbers and Trees Tiergarten series. He photographs trees from specific locations like Central Park in New York, an orchard in Fresno, or the Tiergarten in Berlin, and plots them with numbers and colors, anatomizing them on a grid. The numbers are used as a systematic tool to describe the form, and each etching is titled with a different month to highlight the tacit stages. We created the color grid for each tree, painting individual squares with spit-bite acid on a copper plate. The 4 images are built progressively by layering trees, one on top of the other. The first image is a single tree, followed by 2, 4, and 6 trees, respectively. With each progression, the inks blend to create a prismatic array of color. The clarity of the tonal variation in the first tree is uniquely compelling, as is each individual state of the sequence. A top layer of numbers printed on the face of a plexi box encloses the print. These numbers correspond to the top layered tree on the print behind it, reinforcing its articulation and highlighting the ethereal synthesis of layers. As I mentioned earlier, Edgar Arsenault is one of Charles Gaines' former students. Arsenault is fascinated by language and by establishing unexpected connections among words, objects, places, and people. His installations may incorporate not only drawing, sculpture, and film, but also music, conceptual art, and science, juxtaposing representative elements of each and opening up newfound associations, unintended connections, and interstitial spaces. In his words, a different way to construct relationships among things. Edgar spoke with Charles about his studies, stating, "You performed a very important function at CalArts. My introduction to post-colonial theory and semiotics changed everything for me. You were the person I was always looking for. I had never met anyone who cared about the things I did and who had an intellectual, systematic, and philosophical approach. Other practices I was being introduced to were more identity-based or activist-oriented." Edgar was the creator and founding director of the Watts Housing Project, WHP, in California. This project started in 1996 and is an ongoing collaborative artwork in the shape of a neighborhood redevelopment across from the historic Watts Towers in LA. During our project together, Edgar used architectural drawings of the Watts Towers and adjacent buildings, and with them created a double helix form to symbolize DNA or new life. We printed this form in a series of 9 prints that you can see here, titled Beyond the Great Eclipse. 3 are printed with the form superimposed over images of a book, a magazine cover, and a newspaper covering the news of the 1965 Watts riots. 3 are printed a la poupée in a variety of inks to create a beautiful marbleized result. and the remaining 3 prints are printed in gray, reminiscent of shadows. Here's Edgar in our studio, helping us ink his a la poupée prints. It was a lot of fun. We made another edition with Edgar titled 1968 that depicts the infamous day of MLK's assassination. The sketched figures in the foreground point to the sky, where in the distance the USS Starship Enterprise of Star Trek fame enters the picture frame. This juxtaposition humorously alludes to the disparate and sometimes conflicting accounts of King's death. It points to the absurdity of a still unsolved crime. The 2 elements are demarcated by the title 1968, which was also the year of the Star Trek episode Assignment Earth, in which the Enterprise travels back to Earth on a mission to save the planet and its inhabitants. We can all relate. Another side note is that Uhura, played by Nichelle Nichols, who you may have heard passed away a few weeks ago, was an integral part of the original series Multicultural Crew, and one of the first characters of African descent to be featured on an American television series. Nichols had planned to leave Star Trek in 1967 after its first season, but following a conversation with Martin Luther King, she was persuaded to stay. He helped her realize what an important model for the Black community she would be. It's these slices of history and culture that Edgar so creatively weaves together, allowing us all to explore new ways of seeing and thinking. Again, Gary Simmons is the other student of Charles Gaines that we've published. Simmons uses the process of erasure as an act of alteration. He uses references and stereotypes from American popular culture, making work that addresses the personal and collective experiences of race and class. In a recent discussion about how Charles Gaines influenced his work, he said this: "I would say from the jump that anybody that knows my work knows that my work is about the absence of bodies. There are no figures. There are the traces that are left. Charles taught me how to create a piece that has a broad meaning to it, and to create avenues for other experiences to enter the work without anchoring it to my experience. If I had incorporated my body or somebody else's body into that, you tend to isolate it and you can't import your own experience to the work. It's the traces of Charles. It's the way he has deconstructed a politic and found an avenue for other people to enter it. I studied this very closely and took it directly from him. This is how conceptual art works. It works between the ears. It's not something you can put your hands on." Gary's early works were drawings that were partially erased on old school style blackboards. He also smears paint and other mediums as an act of erasure. Here's a shot of Gary smearing the plates in our studio. He uses his whole body when making his mark, and we had to screw the plates to the wall so that he could work this way. Inspired by snippets of film, even film faders themselves, Simmons explores the text, scenes, and architecture of cinema in his prints. Double Swing Hallway, which you saw him working on in the studio, and here it is framed in our gallery, is an image of chandeliers from the film The Shining, which is a classic ghost story. Simmons is a big fan of horror films and uses the horror film genre as metaphor for American history. And this is long before Jordan Peele and Get Out. Stanley Kubrick montaged the hotel together out of footage from 4 different hotels in The Shining, and makes you think that it's one place. There's this kind of displaced moment for the viewer. Like Kubrick, Gary creates composites of a lot of different places, people, and past histories. Traces and ghosts of the past are present, and the viewer is confronted by memory and haunted by the stories of the voiceless. These 3 artists, Gaines, Arsenault, and Simmons, all have practices that reflect what it is that Paulson Fontaine Press seeks to represent. This is a little microcosm of one thread of connectivity. We are eagerly seeking future projects that further explore the diverse landscape of contemporary Black artists in print. Thank you.
Thanks, Ria. And I'll ask you to stay on the screen. I have a question for you. I'll ask all of our other panelists to open up their screen views as well so we can see them. There seem to be a number of questions directed at just about everyone. So Ria, the first question is, a number of fine art print publishers are responding to the lack of diversity in their publishing rosters and inviting BIPOC artists to make prints. Do you see that as healthy competition, or does it make your job more difficult in attracting artists of color to Paulson Fontaine Press?
You know, that is thrilling information. You know, we want more competition, if that's what that means. I feel like in the arts, we're just kind of scraping the surface right now. There's so much talent, and it's been, you know, generations of talent that, you know, we're left out of the conversation. And so you see, you know, museums all over the country trying to remedy that, looking back at even deceased artists to kind of fill in history and to kind of reshape our thinking about the canon that we've become so accustomed to. So I really encourage it. Like Pam and I say, we just don't have enough hours in the day to work with all of the talent out there. I mean, we have a list, you know, a mile long. So, you know, I think it's important to say also that artists want to be genuinely connected to. So, you know, it's not about just filling out numbers. It's about really having conversations and developing relationships that will be fruitful for everyone involved.
Thanks, Ria. I have a question for Marc from, actually maybe two questions for Marc from folks who joined us today. The first question is regarding the aquatint of the seamstress and the woman at a fitting and some of the other color aquatints that you showed in your slide presentation. The person would like to know, what collections do these aquatints come from? Are they museum collections?
Well, as it happens, the one on the left, the one that I showed on the left with the blue background, was completely unique proof in terms of what it shows in details of work on the plate, as well as for the color difference. She had kept that and sold it to Vollard as part of a massive group of work she sold to him early in the 20th century, when she kind of realized that he was a person who would know better what to do with her things than anyone in her family. And Vollard liked these things so much that he sat on most of them and still had them when he died in 1939, before the Second World War. Henri Petier, who was a great up-and-coming dealer in Paris at the time, acquired pretty much all the works on paper from Vollard's estate, including Picasso's Vollard Suite, and all of these works by Mary Cassatt, prints, drawings, and some pastel counterproofs, etc., etc. And I got these things from the heirs of Henri Petier. The work in blue was one of the first things I saw at Petier's home when he showed me through his collection of Mary Cassatt works, and I instantly fell in love with it because it was so radically different from anything else I had seen before of hers. And I kept it. But the other one is a very nice example also from among the things that we had handled for the heirs of Henri Petier in the past in our exhibitions. And I like to show these things full sheet. I actually also loved would love all museums to exhibit these things always full sheet, because you get an idea of the way it looked when the artist saw it, rather than dolled up in a frame that someone else put around it. The frame is okay, but I would rather see the whole thing. So anyway, yeah, that one belongs to me, and I love it. But it typifies the daring experiments she engaged in with many of her prints. I mean, sometimes things that she ended up printing in dainty blues and greens and colors that she thought would be welcomed by her audience at the time, she experimented with in apricot colors or something totally outrageous before deciding how to print them for public consumption. So that's too big an answer.
Well, but it's a perfect segue to this next question from Janet, who asks, did these women printmakers, and specifically Cassatt, work with the assistance of a master printer?
And that's, of course, as one always says, a very good question. She started off working side by side with Degas, and they would print their own things. And so she was her own printer, but then she wasn't doing editions. I think for the editions that she and Degas and Pissarro, who also worked with them, produced for this never realized publication, a professional printer was engaged. And I don't know the name of that particular printer, but there were editions printed of her intended contribution and Degas and Pissarro's, and probably of some of the others also. It was a group of people who worked on this project, but they worked particularly together. Subsequently, when she did her dry points in the 1889, Nancy Mole Matthews has suggested, and I think it's entirely logical, that Cassatt hired a printer to do editions for her of those prints. Most of the things she did were never published in editions, and she kept them and she did them herself. But since she was going to do a proper edition of 25 of each of these 12 works, she hired a printer, and there's a notable consistency in the style of printing and in placement on the sheet, et cetera, et cetera. Now, when she got to doing the major color prints, in which she was learning as she went along how to separate the colors, and the first print in that series went through over 20 states or stages of development before she was satisfied with it. For that series, she engaged a printer whose name she actually provided to anyone looking at the things or acquiring a set. It was Monsieur Roy, R-O-Y, and she acknowledged him in the inscriptions on each of the ones done for the edition of 25, imprimé par Marie Cassatt and M. Roy, Leroy. Yeah, I mean, Roy was Gauguin's printer, but Leroy was hers. So that was something she needed his help in all the technical fussing, because working with two plates, and she was brushing on the color, and then he was dealing with the registration and getting them to align properly. For that kind of work, she needed help. It was logistically too big a project.
Thanks, Marc. That was a great answer. I have two questions, I think, for Diana. The first question is directly to you. Has Tamarind worked with Cuban printmakers?
Yes. Marge Devon, the wonderful director emeritus who ran Tamarind for 30 years, she brought a number of Cuban artists to Tamarind. We had a number of grants that funded Cuban travel, and Abel Barroso is probably the most recent Cuban artist.
And then the second part of that question is, someone who watched your slide presentation noticed that most of the early Tamarin trained printers who went on to found fine presses were men. Was June Wayne aware of the disparity, and was there an institutional effort to correct it?
Great question. One of our recent graduates, Christine Adams, who's now a printer at ULAE, did a wonderful research paper looking at exactly that, looking at the history of Tamarin printers by gender, and looking through the archive to see, you know, at what point did that balance tip, and it was really in the early 70s. Judith Solodkin was the first woman to make it through the printer training program. There were a number of you know, applications in the archive that were preserved that would clearly say reject female, and so it was something that June Wayne, it's a bit of a contradiction because she was such a champion of women and so aware of how underrepresented women were in the arts, and did lots of studies on it. And yet she viewed the task of being a printer just too physically taxing, and that she discouraged women from the printer training program and kind of politely steered them into the curating program. And so it was really in the 70s that changed. And I would say that now we have lots of women, and certainly a woman master printer at the helm. Valerie Remling, I think, you know, is a strong voice for women printers everywhere.
I agree. Thanks for that answer. And I think we have time for one last question. So it seems to be for Dan. If we can see you, Dan, that would be great. Or otherwise, you can respond from behind the name tag. Dan, have you noticed an increased interest on the part of collectors for women artists and artists of color among the forgotten printmakers whose works you've handled?
I have and I haven't. For years, we've done shows for women artists, African-American artists, Hispanic artists, and we've done numbers of shows through the 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s. The interest in them was always by the collectors. It was rarely by the museums. And so now I'm getting all these museums who are wanting African-American work, are asking me for women's prints, are asking me about all of the things we've been discussing. And I really don't have any anymore. They were all purchased by collectors, mostly 20, 25 years ago. There was a collector named Dave and Reba Williams, who would just start collecting in certain areas that no one else was collecting in. And they had put together a collection of Mexican prints. They put together a collection of African-American prints. They put together a huge collection of WPA prints. All of those prints are now in museums, and virtually all the collectors I worked with over the years who were collecting abstract expressionists, which there were a number of women, were collecting Atelier 17. Most of those, with one exception, because he's not yet ready to give up his collection, but everyone else has donated to major museums, and those collections form the backbones of a lot of museums with their collections. So most of the museums, the questions I'm getting now, when I speak to them, I realize that they really don't understand what they're asking for. They're asking more for a gender or a race than they are for an art form. And I often, I'm raving on here, but I get people coming and wanting me to show them African-American art, and I will. And I'll show them a Richard Hunt, and they don't respond because it's abstract. And a lot of them are looking for identifiable African-American subjects rather than abstraction. The same thing with women's art. I just had a curator at the last print fair ask me what I had in obscure women's prints. I showed her about 30 different women. There's only one she knew. And so that's the one she responded to, a Claire Falkenstein. But she didn't really spend any time looking at the others. So to me, it's always the collectors. Now I'm speaking just for myself. I'm not speaking for any of my colleagues. But I have found the collectors to always be in the forefront of the collecting and ultimately getting them into the museums. So
I think I agree with you, Dan, because museums are often very slow to move on acquisitions, and sometimes private collectors lead the way for us. I'm going to thank all of you for joining us today. This was really fun. I enjoyed working with all of you, and I think everyone in our audience, and we had over 250 people with us today, which is really quite remarkable. I think they enjoyed it too, because they stuck with us through the whole hour. So thank you very, very much, every one of you. And I look forward to seeing many of you soon at the real print fair when we reopen again and can join each other as fellow print lovers. Thanks so much.
thank you.